Children's Church this morning. The rest of you may stand with me as we repeat our Bible pledge today. I pledge allegiance to the Bible, God's holy word. I will make it a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. I will hide its words in my heart that I might not sin against God. You may be seated and turn to the book of 2 Corinthians, chapter 4. 2 Corinthians, chapter 4, either in your Bibles or your electronic devices, whichever it is you choose to use. I'm going to be reading out of the NIV to begin with, and there'll be a portion I'll have you maybe read right along with me. So you do need to look that up this morning, either in the Pew Bible or in some other method. 2 Corinthians, chapter 4, we're going to begin reading in verse number 5. Some of this we read last week. We're going to pick it up kind of in review for this morning. He says in verse number 7 of chapter 4, let's start with verse 7. He says, we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may also be revealed in our mortal body. So then, death is at work in us, but life is at work in you. It is written, I believed, therefore I have spoken. Since we have that same spirit of faith, we also believe and therefore speak. Because we know that the one who raised the Lord Jesus from the dead will also raise us with Jesus and present us with you to himself. All this is for your benefit, so that the grace that is reaching more and more people may cause thanksgiving to overflow to the glory of God. Now let's read this next 3 verses together. Therefore, we do not lose heart, though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. For we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. Meanwhile, we groan, longing to be clothed instead with our heavenly dwelling. Because when we are clothed, we will not be found naked. For while we are in this tent, we groan and are burdened, because we do not wish to be unclothed, but to be clothed instead with our heavenly dwelling, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. Now the one who has fashioned us for this purpose is God, who has given us the Spirit as a deposit, guaranteeing what is to come. Whenever Paul starts out in some of these verses we read last week, early on, he mentions the fact that there's problems that come into our lives. Every one of us have difficulties. I'm going to talk about some of those here a little bit later. We all have struggles. The way he phrases it before he gets into some particulars, he says, we are pressed on every side, but we're not crushed. We talked about that last Sunday. We are perplexed, but we're not in despair. We are persecuted, but we're not abandoned. We are struck down, but we are not destroyed. Aren't you glad about that? That we're never defeated. Our foe, Satan, has already been defeated. He's a defeated foe. And we have to walk in the strength and power of God to overcome him, and indeed we can. Now he says we carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may be revealed in our body. For we who are alive, always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may also be revealed in our mortal body. His life is revealed in our mortal body. Whenever you walk out of church this morning, if you're a Christian, your life is being revealed to the world by your mortal body. You understand that, right? In other words, you're being a testimony for Jesus if you claim to be a Christian when you walk out of this room. Whether it be a good one or a bad one. If you claim to be a Christian, you're giving a testimony. Now last week we talked about this jar of clay thing, and there's a new twist to this in the verses we read this morning. He says we have this treasure that is Jesus. The verses before that said that God shines the light of Jesus in us, which is reflected out. See, before we come to know Jesus, we are darkness. We don't live in darkness, we are darkness. But whenever Jesus comes in, light comes into our life. Now that light is then reflected out. And again, he said, our mortal bodies give testimony to Jesus. But he says this testimony we have is lived in a jar of clay. A jar of clay, or a vessel, what do you call it here in the NIV? A treasure in jars of clay, which may be the best explanation. Back in that day and time, the word for jars of clay, or vessel, is a word which means expendable. Somebody used the word utilitarian, I think it was. In other words, it's a device that was used for a purpose. It had a purpose. It was not decorative. Whenever the device ceased to be used for its purpose, it was discarded. In other words, it's not like porcelain. If you break a porcelain glass, many people will try to repair it. Matter of fact, they say in Japan they will intentionally break things, especially a porcelain or whatever, and then they will put it back together using not glue but gold, which makes it more expensive, and they think makes it more beautiful. But a jar of clay is something once you break it, you throw it away. It's of no use anymore. So what he's telling us is we live our lives in jars of clay. This is really not me. What is really me is my soul, my mind, emotions, and will. When this old body lays itself down, my mind, emotions, and will, my soul will go either to heaven or hell. Not my body, but my soul will be gone. The spirit will return to God who gave it. So here's the point. This body is a jar of clay, which means it's expendable. Someday it'll be thrown aside like an old device. Now further down this morning in chapter 5, verse number 1, he says, we know that if this earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God. Now there's two concepts here. One, the body gets broken. We're wasting away, Paul says at another point, day by day. This body is wasting away. I first met a lot of you all in 1990, and I can look across this crowd today, and I hate to say it, but your bodies are wasting away. You don't look exactly like you did back in 1990. Some of you still have kids at home. Now you got grandkids that come home, or maybe great-grandkids that come home. So our bodies are moving right along. There are some people that were here in 1990, old churches, they're no longer here anymore. Some of them died while I've been here. So they've laid their old utilitarian jar of clay aside. It's been thrown aside, and they left this world. And he says here, though, there's a tent. Now remember, they were living in days of intense persecution. They didn't know what the next breath they might be overran by an enemy of the cross. And so he talks here in terms of tents that are destroyed. When you read the Greek words here that involve all of this, what he's talking about is, if somebody kills you, just be reminded that this old tent you live in is not really the final thing. You've got a eternal house in heaven, not built with human hands. Now he's not talking about a building, he's talking about this. Whatever this is going to look like. I don't know if I'm going to look like this when I get to heaven or not. Hopefully I'll have a body of a 16-year-old and I'll look a whole lot better. Who knows what it's going to be like, but we've got another house that we're going to have in heaven. And he says that, we're groaning for that day whenever that will take place. Well, Paul says in these verses, he says the Christians knew in verse 14, because we know the one who raised Jesus Christ from the dead will also raise us and present us with you to him. Isn't that powerful? Someday we're all going to be raised, and I'm going to be with all you all, and we're going to be presented. We're going to be presented, it says in verse 14, to himself, to Jesus. All the things that's happened, go back up the verses earlier again, he talked about being hard-pressed but not crushed, perplexed but not in despair, persecuted but not abandoned, struck down but not destroyed. He said all of this is for your benefit, so that grace that is reaching more and more people may cause thanksgiving to overflow for God. Some of the things you go through in your life, some of the struggles, some of the problems, is for God's glory, and is for, you might say, information for other people. As they watch you living for God, as they watch you going through your struggles, it's then because you are successful by relying on God and His grace is poured out in you, the grace that's sufficient for you. As that grace is poured out, they see that grace at work, they see your continued trust in God, and as a result of that, they come to trust in God also. And he says, as a result, we're all going to be raised up together. But in the meantime, we've got struggles. James 1 verses 2 and 4 says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." Count it joy. Now that doesn't mean we get excited when troubles come. I sure don't. But he says at the same point in time, count it joy. Joy is different than happiness, right? I mean, I can be joyful anytime. I might be unhappy when the Rangers lose, but I can still have joy in my heart. Or whoever it is that's your favorite team. But the fact is, we have trials. We go through trials. And the question is, what are trials? The Bible actually lists 8 categories of trials that we go through. 8 different categories. One category, when you read in the Scripture, is fiery trials. Have you ever went through fiery trials? Fiery trials are those things that are intense encounters. They're intense struggles. Fiery trials are things that can border on the fact of bursts of anger. You ever been guilty of that? You don't have to raise your hand if you don't want to. Have to raise mine. A burst of anger. Another fiery trial can be grief when it comes into our lives. I mean, there are people, Ken mentioned a little bit ago, that have gone through some pretty tough grief this year. That's a fiery trial. What about lust? And we're not talking about just sexual stuff here. Lust is a fiery trial. If you, before you became a Christian, were a thief, whenever you have an opportunity to steal, that could be a fiery trial. The devil trying to get you to go and do it again, whatever it is. Lusting for anything, the lust of the flesh, and that includes anything that you have a craving or a desire for. The second major category, besides fiery trials, are infirmities. Now, we've had people going through infirmities forever. Roy Bowden's went through an infirmity this week. Bonnie's going through an infirmity physically this week. We have physical limitations that come in on us. Those are infirmities. We have illnesses. We have diseases. And so those things are going to happen. They're going to come into our lives as a test. The third thing, besides fiery trials and infirmities, are reproaches. Reproaches is when someone ridicules you because of your faith. They ridicule you because of the life that you're living, a life of holiness. They reject you on account of the fact that you're a Christian, or they reject you on account of the kind of life that you're living. Those are reproaches. So there's fiery trials, infirmities, reproaches, and then there's persecutions. Persecutions, probably in our day, and in our place anyway in America, would be the fact that you're harassed because of your religious convictions. Facebook is full of harassment for religious convictions. All you got to do is put something out there that you believe, and I guarantee within a few hours, somebody's going to dislike it. And they're going to say something negative against it. A persecution is opposition, again, because of your religious convictions. So you got fiery trials, infirmities, reproaches, persecutions. And then the next thing we all have, and that's called necessities. Necessities are the things that are the wear and tear of daily things. I mean, there are people right now that are going through necessity struggles. It may be that you don't have enough money for the month. You ever been there? You just don't have enough. You're struggling. And all of that, necessities are when we're trying to raise our kids or our grandkids or whatever the issues are. All of these struggles that are daily responsibilities. We all have trials in necessities from time to time. It never failed years ago when we're barely making ends meet. Like somebody said, about the time I make ends meet, somebody goes and moves the end. And that's kind of what happens every time. It just kind of moves along. You just about catch up and something else happens. It seemed like it never failed. The washer would go out. When the washer went out, a car would break down, and then something else would go crazy. The kids would come in and say, Dad, I need $100 for school this week for our trip next summer. You know, something always seemed to hit you like that. Necessities. Daily wear and tear of living. So we got fiery trials, infirmities, reproaches, persecutions, necessities, and then we have distresses. Distresses is what can eat on us as Christians. Distresses is whenever we face disappointments. Things didn't come out exactly like we thought they would. Whatever that may be. It might be in terms of a will. It might be in terms of a job that you've got. It might, whatever. It might be in terms of buying something or whatever the situation is. It's disappointments that enter into our lives. And we struggle over those kind of distresses whenever we go through disappointments. Another type of distress is whenever you get a deep hurt in your life. Somebody does something that hurts you, and the temptation that we have in that is to hold on to it, and we allow that anger and that hurt to fester into something called bitterness, and if we're not careful, we'll commit murder. If not literally, we'll commit it in our hearts. Distresses come. Friend, I want to guarantee you, disappointments are going to come in your life. You can't get away from them. I'm going to guarantee you, you can't get away from deep hurts. But you've got to be willing to forgive, and you've got to be willing to go on, because the Bible says, Jesus said, if you don't forgive, you are not forgiven. So what does that mean if you're not forgiven by God? What do you think that means? A couple are pointing down. That's right. If you're not forgiven by God, you're going to hell. And he says, if I don't forgive you for something you do to me, then he's not going to forgive me. So we stand guilty. This thing of forgiveness, deep hurts, disappointments, again, the big category is distresses, is a serious matter in our Christian lives. Not only that, you got tribulations. These are unusual pressures. These are unusual challenges that come into our life. They just kind of come, and I guess the best term I can use is they blindside us. They just hit us up the side of the head, and there they are. Tribulations, unusual challenges that come our way. And then the last one, again, with fiery trials, infirmities, reproaches, persecutions, necessities, distresses, tribulations, and then we got just plain old temptation, in which Satan is trying to get you to do something that is sinful and something that is wrong. And you can either give in, or you can do what I've been telling you to do for a long time. You can draw nigh to God, and He'll draw nigh to you, and you can tell Satan to go, and he will flee from you. And you don't even have to yell and scream and holler at him to get him to do that. You know that voice. Whenever your mom or dad used to call you or say something to you, and you were doing something, you know what that is. Mom didn't have to yell at all. All she had to do was call your name. George. And you knew exactly what she was talking about. Just look at Satan and say, Satan, get out of here. You don't have to yell and scream. Just tell him to go when you draw near to God. And of course, there are really two basic types of trials overall. These are the trials we go through. One is the temptation, which Satan will throw at us, because Satan wants to defeat us. And the other is the test. The test is when something is designed to determine whether or not we're going to obey God. So we have a choice to give in to temptation or to consider the test to see if we're going to obey God. And the good news in these verses, it says that we're going to be raised with Jesus. By the power, by the agency of Jesus. God raised Jesus from the dead. Jesus will raise us to be with Him. John 5:25 says, truly I say to you, the hour is coming, and now is, when the dead shall hear the voice of the Son of God, and they who hear shall live. For as the Father has life in Himself, so He has given to the Son to have life within Himself, and He has given Him authority to execute judgment also, because He is the Son of Man. Do not marvel at this, for the hour is coming, in which all who are in the graves shall hear His voice, and shall come forth, those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have practiced evil to the resurrection of condemnation. So we go through trials. And as we go through trials, the thing that helps us get through this is the fact that God is with us, and He extends grace to us. We sang about it this morning. His grace is sufficient for me. I looked up on the internet this week and I found out there's another song titled His Grace is Sufficient by Jennifer Knapp. She says, when I've exhausted every possible solution, I've tried every last game there is to play, in this search for the Christ-like perfection, I'm convinced I've only left God ashamed. I cry, I wonder, can He hear my despair? Afraid to lift my hands, afraid He doesn't care. And if He answers and I fall again, can I still be His daughter? Can I still depend on Him? When I'm down and search every mistake looking for new regrets, sometimes I forget that His grace is sufficient for me, that it's deeper and wider than I can conceive. His grace is sufficient for me. There's another one written by a man by the name of McNaughton. His grace was sufficient for me. He says, His grace was sufficient for me when in trembling and fear to His side I drew near, and He cleansed me from sin, made my heart pure within. His grace was sufficient for me. Verse 2 says, His grace is sufficient for me. And whatever my lot, I hear His fear not. I am safe in His care, who can guard from every snare. His grace is sufficient for me. Verse 3 says, His grace is sufficient for me. All my need He'll provide, and my steps homeward guide. And in death I shall sing as I rest neath His wing. His grace is sufficient for me. And the last verse says, His grace is sufficient for me. When in mansions of bliss, still my theme shall be this. And for aye I shall sing to the praise of my King, whose grace is sufficient for me. Chorus simply says, for me, His grace is sufficient for me. For me, His grace is sufficient for me. And he says there will be glory beyond measure in chapter 4, verse number 17, for our light and momentary troubles. Can you imagine that? Whatever you're going through today, however intense the temptations and the struggles I just mentioned earlier, however intense are all of these fiery trials and infirmities and reproaches and persecutions and necessities and distresses and tribulation and temptation, it doesn't matter how intense they are, Paul calls them light and momentary afflictions, that they will produce in us an eternal weight of glory. So what do temptations cause us to do? What do these trials bring into our life? I like what one said, they have a tendency to wean us from the world. They have a tendency to purify our heart by enabling us to break off from the sins on account of which God afflicts us. They have a tendency to cause us to look to God for consolation and support in our trials. They have a tendency to induce us to contemplate the glories of the heavenly world. They have a tendency to cause us to seek heaven as our home. And they have a tendency to urge us to seek God in every situation that comes up in our lives. That's why trials come. It's to help us to lean on God. Whether they're light afflictions or for us, whether there's something heavy and powerful. You got to always remember that in every situation, His grace is sufficient for us. Matter of fact, Isaiah 48:10 says this, Behold, I have refined you not with silver. I have chosen you in the furnace of affliction. I've chosen you in the furnace of affliction. When you're going through dark times, God is there refining you, forming you, and making you into what He wants you to be. Let's stand for prayer this morning. Our Heavenly Father, how we do love You today. And indeed, we realize that there are times in our lives where we really wonder if we're going to make it through. But the good news is we've got the promise that You always stand near us. We may indeed be hard-pressed on every side, but we're not going to be crushed because You're there. We're perplexed, but we're not in despair because You're there. We're persecuted and not abandoned because You're there. We're struck down, but we're not destroyed because You're walking beside us and You're walking with us. And Father, whatever our trials today, I pray that You'll help us to trust in You. I don't know if anybody would like to pray this morning, but if you would, we certainly would invite you to come and pray. It could be you've been going through a fiery trial or a trial of necessity, a temptation. It could be that things have been rough and you just need to come and talk to God today. I would invite you to come and kneel and talk to Him about the situation. Just to cast that care upon Him, to put all that weight of all the struggle upon Him. I tell you today, you don't have to carry it on your own. The infirmities, the reproaches, the persecutions, the distresses, we can cast those on Jesus and find, again, that His grace is always sufficient for the moment, and He'll see us through. Whether it's in an instant, or whether it takes a few days or a few weeks, He'll be right there by our side, holding our hand, seeing us through. Just like His love to course through us, to have His own way in our lives. As the song in the verses we read this morning says, we're the clay and He's the potter. He forms us into the vessel that He wants us to be. And He, someday, whenever that vessel has worn out its usefulness, whatever age that is, whether it be 40 or 50 or 60 or 110, the old dust will be cast aside, and we'll get to go and enter into glory. Father, how we love You this morning. As a Christian, I just want to say, Lord, that I want to thank You for the times in my life when it's been dark, when it's been difficult, when struggles have been real. And to say I'm thankful always that You're there. You've always been near. Even though at times it didn't seem like there was going to be any way out. It didn't look like there was going to be enough money to ever cover my expenses. Even though it didn't seem like there was ever going to be a defeat of Satan and the temptations he was throwing at me. Even though there were fiery trials that came along the way. To look back, I'm so glad today to say that You have been near me. You have been with me. Your grace has been sufficient for every trial and every situation of life. And as we leave here this morning, remind us again. Someone needed this today, Lord. You need to remind us again that Your grace is sufficient for me. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.